Mr. Speaker, will you please call the House to order?
The bill is passed.
We'd like to get a budget that represents the interests of the people who are standing here with me now.
To be part of the struggle to achieve a better society for all.
I'm very compassionate to what's happening upstate. And I'm very compassionate to what's happening downstate.
Hello and welcome to Assembly Update. I'm Liz Koenig. Today we're going to be discussing election law reform as well as several other issues. Joining me to discuss these topics is Assemblyman Walter Mosley, who represents the 57th Assembly District in Brooklyn. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
Always great to see you. So the Assembly has brought up election law reform. It seems year after year after year,
right.
And there are a lot of issues tied into this, kind of umbrella topic, election law reform. But one of the things we want to talk about is ranked choice voting. What can you tell us about that?
Well, everybody knows about some of the more common issues: early voter registration, online voter registration, extending one's ability to vote early on election day or leading up to election day. But there's one particular topic that I have been given the task to kind of spearhead in the Assembly, being the prime sponsor now. This this reintroduced bill. It was originally introduced by now Senator Brian Kavanaugh, who used to be a member of in our chamber in the Assembly. It's called ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is something that's being applied in other jurisdictions, San Francisco being one of a very similar jurisdiction, comparably speaking to New York, where instead of runoffs, which could be costly, time-consuming, and be inherently advantageous to one particular segment of the community over another, what ranked choice voting allows is for people to have on their ballot, depending on how many candidates, and obviously it only kicks in once one is not able to get in New York State, 50% or more of the necessary votes particularly in New York City, 50% or more of the votes cast. If they can't, it goes to automatic runoff traditionally. In ranked choice voting, what you do, you rank the number. If you have 10 candidates, you rank them 1 to 10 as to who would you prefer to have this particular position. Once it's determined that one person does not have the necessary requisite amount to actually win the primary, win the general, instead of going to a traditional runoff, it would then go in rank order. It would go from bottom to the top in terms of people who accumulate, the most ones, and then the most twos, the most threes, most fours, and it gets to a point where that becomes your internal mechanism for an automatic runoff based upon the ranking of those particular candidates. It's something that's working phenomenally well in San Francisco. It saves millions of dollars. It promotes positive campaigning as opposed to a lot of the negativity we're seeing, and it promotes distinguishing yourself from your opponents as opposed to what can I do to bring my opponents down. Right. So we think it's a win-win situation, fiscally speaking, from a public policy position. But at the same time, we understand we have some hurdles to overcome because a lot of people see this as something very new and radical and something that we would have to take more of a closer look going forward if we're going to pass this into law. It's
an interesting concept, but it seems as if the candidates would be more issue-focused rather than trying to bring the other person down.
And that's what we want. We want people to be, focusing on their platforms or their opposing platforms in an effort to further educate the electorate. That's what we want in terms, and if we can further educate the electorate, we can possibly have more voter participation ultimately in the long run. So we're looking forward to not only just passing the more traditional, common, voter registration platform, but voter reform platforms, but also some of these nuanced policies that I think could increase participation, provide for a robust electoral process, as well as bringing out or taking out some of the negativity that is so commonly associated with electoral politics.
Now let's move on and talk about your Facebook town hall that you had recently.
Yes.
What were some of the issues that were discussed?
A lot, from how the federal tax provisions are impacting our state and local tax or state and local tax write-offs, to education, transportation, infrastructure. A lot of questions as it relates to infrastructure and transportation in terms of the MTA in particular, and how we as a state, our budget's trying to combat some of the shortfalls in our transportation system. Obviously, congestion pricing was also talked about, how that relates to how we're raising or beginning to generate more revenue for the MTA in an effort to not only maintain it, but also to advance it to a 21st century transportation hub. Education, obviously foundation aid, and how we're continuing to fail to meet the needs and demands that was stipulated in the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit many years ago. And then we talked about some local issues, and how, we were able to either ascertain appropriations in order to meet and satisfy some of the demands that are germane to our district, like affordable housing. We talked about some of the provisions and some of the resources we were able to allocate in terms of stemming the flow of homelessness and those who are on the verge of homelessness, which is critical. And obviously we talked about some of the failed policies that were not put in the budget, like the criminal justice reform package, which we believe is critical in our efforts to not only deal with criminal justice from a practice standpoint, but also how do we close Rikers Island in a responsible way, so that we can have a more efficient criminal justice system, which is more sustainable, less costly on our state budget, while at the same time making sure that the needs and demands of those within the system are being met. So it was a fruitful conversation. We'll have another Facebook town hall at the end of the year in terms of drilling down on the budget, in terms of things that are specifically germane to the district, as well as some of the policies that will be able to pass the remainder of this session.
Do you find using this technology is becoming more and more popular out there? Do you think there are more people responding to this?
It is, but it's a slow process because people are so geared towards writing and having something tangible in their hands, or in which they can read or put aside and read at their own leisure. Because when you do something like this, obviously, if you really want to be involved, you got to set aside time to be a part of it in real time. But the good thing about technology is that you can go back to it anytime to my Facebook page. It will be there in perpetuity as long as the page exists. But we're constantly seeing more and more people get away from the more traditional, paper, getting more into the e-commerce and the way of communicating through electronics and technology. So we're going to continue to do this, and hopefully it will catch on with my colleagues as well as our constituents throughout our district.
That's a great way. I mean, constituents can just log on and ask you a question right there.
Correct.
You can just answer it in real time.
In real time, and we often get that. We get a lot of our questions prior to as we're promoting, but we often get a lot of questions from people who are logged in and who are sending us messages as we go along. And that is still up on our page, and it'll be up on our page in perpetuity.
Now, speaking of technology, you had the opportunity to go to MIT in Cambridge over the weekend.
Right.
What was that? What was the purpose of the visit?
Well, this is a year-long fellowship that I'm a part of with MIT and the Mel King Fellowship with the MIT Collab, which is a collaboration. It's a fellowship that's really geared towards bringing about ideas and as it relates to cooperative economics. Last year we went to Spain to visit one of the more prominent European cooperative economic initiatives in Mondragon, Spain, in northern Spain, not too far from Barcelona, and see how cooperative economics and redefining what labor is and redefining what the existence of current labor, employer to employee relationships, how they coexist, and in an effort to kind of diminish or bring down the level of poverty, inability to have access to resources. And our job as fellows is to find companies who are already existing or would like to exist or be created in an effort to take advantage of this model of cooperative economics in terms of giving a vested advantage, an invested position of employees who are now just merely employees, but giving them ownership in their work. And as a result, deal with the issue of affordability, deal with the issue of poverty in our state and in our cities, which is a growing concern because we're starting to see more and more people either in one boat or the other. And our effort is to how do we redefine our economy so that we can narrow that gap while at the same time, promoting something that is happening globally with our businesses as well as our employees.
Now, there's been a lot of talk recently in the news about cannabis, and it's a very controversial issue.
Right.
Some people feel very strongly on both sides. What is happening right now? What's this discussion?
Well, as you know, the conversation is being had, at the federal level as well as the state level. We anticipate the state of New Jersey will, with the new governor saying that one of his first executive orders would be to legalize marijuana in the state, and in a sense from a medicinal standpoint, as well as from a parochial, socialized standpoint in terms of those who use it for personal use, decriminalizing it. But for me, as someone who's looking to get on the board of a couple of cannabis firms that are operating throughout the country and will hopefully look to operate here in New York, is to kind of redirect the conversation, particularly within communities of color, where we look at it as a public safety issue, as well as a criminal justice issue. Those who are being accosted and jailed for small, carrying small amounts of marijuana, but not being treated, but treatment being, handed down differently in other segments of our population, and how we can create distilleries and all the ancillary things that are affiliated with these distilleries, the chemists, the manufacturers, those who provide the lighting, those who provide the organic resources, the transportation of those resources, the transportation of the monetary deposits, which have to be done in community banks as opposed to federally subsidized banks, the security that's needed for this. When you go into these plants, people often want to say that, you're going to see like some guys with some baggies and they're putting all this stuff together. But this is a very sophisticated industry that requires a serious conversation, and how we can be a part of that conversation. And I'm looking forward to being a part of that conversation and to be that face to convey that to communities of color and to all communities who have a misnomer as to why, we should be embracing this industry as opposed to fighting it.
Now, I know there are many other states in the nation who have decriminalized marijuana, and it seems to be working well for them. So I imagine we'll be taking pieces from all of them and coming up with our own
certainly.
plan.
We've had our conversation already in terms of the medical use of marijuana, and that was an exhaustive conversation. I think it's probably, removed a lot of the barriers to the conversations going forward in terms of this legalizing it for recreational as well as medicinal purposes. But at the same time, we understand that there are segments of the community population. I understand that, in the past, we've had so many young men and women who have been criminalized for such activity, and we want to deal with that as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Assemblyman Walter Mosley, who represents the 57th Assembly District in Brooklyn. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.